Hey everybody, welcome to Dev Empathy Book Club, where we inspire each other to become better developers and better people by building our empathy skills. This month we will be talking about Don't Make Me Think, which I don't have the book on me to hold up. And this will be, since this book is a little bit smaller, we're going to be doing one book for this one session instead of doing half the book, which is what we normally do on one of these calls. And then next month we'll be covering the second book, sort of in like a series, like an actual successor to this book. So they kind of play together well. And this has been a fun read. But before I dive into my thoughts, I'd love to, Ariel, get your thoughts. How are you doing, and what do you think of the book so far?
Well, I mean, it's not so far right. We're doing the whole thing now, but I guess I think I just violated the rule of yes and. So, yeah. Look, I enjoyed it a lot. There's a lot of really good content. I like the fact that he kind of takes his own advice to heart, and he gets a little bit meta about it at the beginning, just kind of saying like, I'm not trying to write, a full gigantic guide to usability. I'm trying to give you, the highlights, because that's pretty much what you need in order to succeed. Unless you're going to basically have his job, which is a usability consultant. He's like, this is the stuff that you need to know if you can't afford to hire me. And he really does a good job of conveying that in a pretty abbreviated fashion. Ironically, it sometimes makes it feel a little bit more like a one-on-one textbook. In that you end up having a lot of these big picture concepts, a lot of bullets and little supporting visuals, but it's not it doesn't feel like a deep dive, but that's actually not necessarily a bad thing, is how I would put it. There was one concern that I had with the book, and I don't want to talk too long because I want to hear your thoughts also. There was a little bit of a concern that I had just in terms of it felt very much like a white, American white dude's guide for American white dudes designing websites for American white dudes. It was to be fair, there was an attempt to use a lot of feminine language, a lot of she's and hers all over, and in the images as well, the little cartoons and stuff. But I don't think there was in all the cartoons, there was like a single person of color. There was not a single disabled person, although thankfully there was a chapter on accessibility. And, it was sort of easy to forget that when you are trying to make something usable, you really do have to make something usable for distinct populations. And sometimes, products are fairly universal, and some products, really are not. And it kind of reminded me of when Apple came out with their fitness tracker, which tracked everything except for female reproductive health. There was no menstrual cycle tracker, which is a pretty common common need for those who have menstrual cycles. So it basically meant that it was not not as usable, right? This is a kind of missing feature where it's not just a missing feature, right? It means that, okay, should I even use this as my health tracker, because there's a whole bunch of information that I won't be able to input into this. There's no place to have that information there. I think it's the same thing with a lot of usability questions. Is you really have to make sure that you're getting a diverse sampling of people to do your usability testing. And and just in general, when you think about usability questions, you have to make sure that you're covering a very, very broad base. There was also this one heading that got me a little bit uncomfortable. There's a certain style of humor throughout the book, which I just didn't find it that funny. Not in a critical way. I just didn't really appeal to me. But he referred he in the whole chapter about usability testing, he did mention at some point do online testing, through sites like usertesting.com. But he referred to that as alternative lifestyles, which I thought that just wasn't necessary. That's a pretty loaded term. It was just weird to me to use that as a joke. So I don't want to disqualify the whole book because of these issues. I think there's a lot to learn from it. But I also think we'd be remiss if we didn't point it out as we go into discussing the book.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up. It was definitely going to be my first thing to point out if you hadn't just then. So yeah, this is one of those books that I had read years ago. That it was a nice, refreshing, refreshing both in change of contrast to from our previous books, but also refreshing. And then I think myself and everyone enjoy when you read a book and they spout opinions that you already agree with. And I'm not a usability consultant. I'm a general software consultant, but a lot of my job is to make calls that are correct by my clients. Right now I'm currently working with a client who is pseudo project managing on their end. They're the boss of the company, but they're also calling all the shots, and they're just like, hey, I need you to help me. Like, I don't know where these buttons should go. Like, the designer's not around anymore. I just need you to make the best call. So he is relying on us as consultants to know what is the best practice when it comes to making the site approachable for users. And I was explaining to him A/B testing and getting users on and things that were in this book. And I was able to point at it on my shelf and be like, yeah, this thing that I'm reading, it goes over these types of things we're talking about. So I did enjoy that. I enjoyed that it was light and kind of a little easier to get through with some of the pictures. It was in that regard, it was a nice contrast. Everything you said is 100% on point though. And I noticed it more now than I did how many years ago it was when I first read this, that due to its intro primer level depth, it fell into a trap I've seen people fall into where it has an assumed default, right? It has an assumed default, which is, like you said, is the straight white man living in the US as we are the people who make sites and we are the people who use websites. So clearly we'll talk about us the whole time, blah, blah, blah. And while a lot of the things that are talked about in the book are just general human psychology and they do apply across the board, the fact that you can see the joke there and some of the examples, they reveal some of the potentially some of the lack of insight from the authors around how it's going to affect different cultures, or how this can affect different people from different backgrounds. And I think it is worth bringing up because that's something that we try to stay on top of when it comes to empathy, when it comes to building our websites, building our applications. So overall I liked it, and I think it's going to be a fun dive in today as we kind of talk more about some of the chapters.
Totally. So let's go.
All right. So let's start off with the namesake of the book, Don't Make Me Think, which I love because that's the kind of thing, again, I go talk to my team and I'm like, okay, when I am your usability expert number one, when they build something and they want to give the client, let me look at it. And I'm like, what? No. I should just know how this works. You shouldn't have to explain it to me. I shouldn't have to be there. I should just know it. So Ariel, give me your thoughts on this kind of overarching tenet of the book itself.
Yeah. So what's funny to me about it is I really like the phrase "Don't make me think." And look, I come from a Ruby background. I've been programming Ruby for a whole bunch of years at this point. And one of the big kind of buzz phrases in Ruby world is programmer happiness, right? And there's actually a lot, I think, in common between those two ideas, right? Is that things should follow what the creator of Ruby, Yukio Matsumoto, calls the principle of least surprise. So the question is who's least surprised, but basically things should work the way that you expect them to work. If you expect that there's going to be a utility there, then it should be there. And that's not something that that every language designer agrees with, but there really is a mentality here of and it's true that it can apply to physical products. It can apply to the layout of a physical space. It can apply to APIs and CLI tools and libraries. But in all of these cases, the way that you name things, the way that you organize things, there are conventions that are probably a lot harder to identify than the things that are talked about in this book. But they're absolutely there. There are conventions. There are things that we expect to be there. There are ways that we expect things to be phrased. Even something as simple as, do you use camel case or snake case or Pascal case? these things actually matter. It doesn't matter which one the language kind of agrees on, but once the language has agreed on it, you got to stick with it, because otherwise it's going to be just really, really annoying for the people that you're that are using the tools that you're creating. There are other elements of the book that that I can think of just as an example, right? So he talks about making sure that there are signifiers in right when you need them, right? Kind of just-in-time instructions. The best example I can think of is an exit sign. So if I'm in a building, I'm not necessarily paying attention to where all the exits are. There's like they always they tell you as a safety tip, like look for exit signs as soon as you enter a room, which it's a way to live, and probably we'd all be a lot safer if we did. But it's probably not realistic, right? What's really important is the moment that you hear the word fire, you're able to look up and immediately find an exit sign. And suddenly, where you put those exit signs and making sure that they're not, blocked by a pole or something like that, that's really important. So I think there's a lot of very general concepts here that we can apply in all sorts of areas of life. I think really very much in our programming. A little bit less in application code, but definitely in the external interfaces to the code that we're writing. So whether we're creating APIs, whether we're creating command line tools or libraries, things that other programmers are going to use, the external API of all those products, right? And I use the word product very generally, right? Not just things that are sold, but whole value creating things. The external interface becomes all the more important, and we need to come at it from a sense of don't make me think. What is the way that a user who has not bothered to read the documentation is going to try? What are the things that they're going to try to do? And it's often a hard question to answer without actually trying it out. But we so rely on people to like read documentation and to we assume they're just going to know everything. And no, what they're going to do is they're going to download your library. They're going to start playing with it. Like that's what we do with other people's libraries. Why do we think that other people are going to act differently with ours? So I'm like stretching out into a lot of areas, but again, the main idea is thinking about don't make me think not just as a mentality for websites and mobile apps, but as a mentality for all of the things that we create that have some kind of a user.
Yeah, I definitely can think that applies. This is something that I've been a long advocate for, which is like bringing usability and design into our code as developers. Like I just personally have a soft spot for, I like building tools for people. Like I don't generally enjoy tools for tools' sake, but I really enjoy finding a problem in a team and then building something to help them. And a lot of that came from dealing with bad tools, about dealing with tools that someone built that ostensibly made the problem worse, because now you have to deal with this bad tool that doesn't help at all. But yeah,
cough, AWS cough.
Yeah. Oh, that's one of the worst offenders. But there's so many small things we can do. I think about this and I think about like safe by default, like a trend we're seeing in more frameworks and libraries where it's like, okay, by default, we're going to put on the right settings for you so you can't shoot yourself in the foot, because assuming you're going to read the instructions and turn something off and add this to get ignore and do that means you're just opening the ground for someone to have missed step 2 out of 4 and then cause a problem for themselves down the road. Stuff like that. This principle also makes me think of the design of everyday things that we read a while ago at this point, and how that was talking about physical products, but how that really applies to this idea of like the common sense doorway, or the teapot with the handle, where okay, we're building websites and CLIs and things, and if anything, it's more important to adhere to those things because we don't have any shared physicality that we're used to. We have to really be consistent with how we lay things out, due to it being all fabricated. But yeah, so I think that's good. Moving on from that, though, there were some terms thrown around in this book, and this will be fun because I will attempt to pronounce this word, which is satisficing. I just kind of pronounce it in my mind as satisfyingly what's the word? Basically like compromising is how I read it. I read this like finding a compromisingly satisfactory compromise is the way I always thought of it. But I couldn't figure out how to say it out loud. And this was the idea of trying to, come up with a reasonable plan and trying out if it works and then refusing if it doesn't, right? So Ariel, what were your thoughts on this concept that was kind of introduced in the book and kind of talked about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's basically like when I read through the book, I think I read through that part and then I remember the term, but I didn't really remember what it means. And when I came back to it a little bit later, as I was sort of reviewing the contents of the book so that we could put together this episode, I was like, oh yeah, let me see if I can really nail down that definition. I pronounce it satisficing. I don't know. It's a hard word to pronounce. Yeah. So again, it comes from studies of how people make decisions when there's something that's maybe complex and difficult and also very pressing that's facing them. So for example, let's say you have a team of firefighters who's trying to figure out how to rescue people from a building, right? So your assumption is they're going to evaluate all the possibilities and figure out which is the one that's most likely to save the people, and then try to execute on it. And what they found was that people literally just think about it, find any plan that might possibly work, and try to do it. And if they're doing this for things like rescuing people from burning buildings, all the more so that when people come to your site, what they're going to do, they're going to satisfy. They're going to try to find like the first thing that looks like it might possibly give them the results that they need. They're going to do it. And if it works, then great. And then they're just going to do that same thing forever. And if it doesn't work, then they're going to try something else. But it's the idea is basically like we don't have time to think about all the possibilities that are out there. We want to act, and we don't necessarily have the capacity to weigh the costs and benefits of various possible plans. And so we just run with whatever is the first idea that pops into our heads. So when someone comes to a site, they're just going to click on a link, and if it doesn't work, then they're going to hop into the search box, right? But they're just going to do stuff. And if you don't make the right way of doing things very available and very obvious, they're going to go with the wrong way. And if that wrong way if they are so unfortunate as to find out that the wrong way of doing it works for them, they're going to do that every time, because frankly, your site is not important enough to them for them to spend the time optimizing their efforts to get stuff done on your site. So that was a really, I think, really powerful concept, really important one, of just like the sticky power of bad plans. And there's definitely broader implications of the idea of satisficing. I mean, certainly development process goes into that box of we find a process that to some degree allows us to get like a task done one time, and then we just follow that process forever without evaluating it very often. So there's a lot of implications of that. I don't want to stray too far afield, but mainly, again, in terms of a design context, right? It means that if you let people get to the right stuff the wrong way, people will get to the right stuff the wrong way. The other term that I think was really important to define was muddling through. So what is that about? What it means is, I don't know how this technology works. I'm going to come up with a guess. And as long as I'm able to use a technology based on the assumption that my guess is correct, I'm just going to not change that. And so I'm just going to act as though my mental model of the technology is correct until I find something that doesn't jive with it, and then I have to reevaluate. So what that basically means is someone could come to your site, they could have a totally incorrect idea as to how it works, and try to accomplish something, and they'll get pretty far up to the point where the way that they were trying to do it basically breaks down. But sometimes that's not even going to happen. They have a total wrong conception of how things work, and they're just going to run with it, and nothing will ever alert them to the fact that they've made a mistake. And there could be some really interesting and potentially disastrous unintended consequences of muddling through. A lot of that comes from just people don't have time to understand, every element of every site that they ever land on. Some of that comes from just a lack of effort to explain things, effectively. And some of that comes from a lack of effort to test their explanations to see if people really did understand things or not. I think there was one really, really good example in the chapter on where they kind of went through a practical usability test where the person just completely confused ideas as to different pricing models of freelance services, right? You basically, there's one where you kind of pay by time and one where you pay by work product, something like that, and just the terminology had them thinking it was backwards, and so they could get pretty far, muddling through based on that assumption, and end up, signing a contract that they don't really understand, and then being up for a lot more money than they thought. So how do you deal with people satisficing and muddling through, right? That's, again, that's a lot of this book. But I think understanding those terms and understanding those behaviors, right, the tendency to do these things is really important as just kind of the baseline. I've been talking for a while, so I'll throw it over the fence back to you.
Not to reiterate anything you said, I think that totally makes sense. And not only is it important to know and define those terms, but then to think about that when we approach our stuff. And this made me think of two things, both what you were saying and this kind of thought process around this part of the book. Was it reminded me of, or it made me enjoy the fact that we're talking about the way your app actually behaves and not focusing on the way it looks, right? Like looks are a part of this, but this is something that, again, I have to explain to clients quite fairly often, which is like there's difference between the usability of your website and then just the design of it, right? Like you can have a very, very nice looking, sharp, modern design from a very expensive designer, but you can put the buttons in the wrong spot and it doesn't make any sense, or people just muddle through it every single time they use it. And I think we see that more often than we don't see that these days, where you get some awesome designers who are extremely talented, and then you end up, that meets the client, and then that meets the programmer, and then that just ending up with a product that looks good, but it's just awful to use. And that's because I think the usability is what got lost in that shuffle. And the second thing that makes me think of is every non-tech job I ever worked growing up, we had some software we used. Most of them were web-based, but almost always they were on a computer in the back room, and the managers who ran the company, and especially like the assistant managers, none of them really knew how the software worked. It was always just a combination of these two things. It was either they were muddling through, or there was some little bit of sprinkling of cargo culting, and they would always click this button. They'd always click this link from an email to open it, and then they would go through these 4 pages first every time. Why? I don't know. You just got to do that, and then go to another page, and then go through here. Now we can run the night's reports, but make sure the zero's in there first before you start. Like, why does the zero have to be there? No, it just has to be there. And me as like a teenager trying to just get my job done, I was super curious why it was this way, but I never got the answers. And I could just assume nowadays that it was just years built up of problems and solutions and just people guessing and being like, okay, this is how it works. We don't want to break it, and all those sites could have used some more affordances, as it were, to kind of make these things a little bit better for the users, maybe avoid some of that.
It's funny that you talk about more affordances. Ironically, I think that sometimes the solution is fewer affordances. Don't let people do things that they shouldn't be able to do. So, just as one example, right? If you have a phone number field, why are you ever letting people enter letters into it, right? It's kind of a silly example, but there are ways that we can basically build in protections, right? The same way that back in the days of the Don Norman book, right, The Design of Everyday Things, we spoke about constraints built into systems that basically force you to do the right thing. There are ways we can build those constraints into the systems we create for people to use, where they cannot help but do the right thing. And we have to be very careful in what direction we're guiding them. But you have to, like, just as one example, right? So like, let's say I'm on my, I'm on my terminal, and like every single time I want to run a command that, that requires higher permissions, I have to preface it with the magical incantation sudo, right? However you pronounce it. So like, why do I need that? I mean, every time I want to run a command, like I can always just add those 4 letters, before the command, and then it'll do it for me. Why are you making me add those letters? Well, the answer is sometimes you really shouldn't be adding those letters. And we want to make sure that you're deliberately doing a dangerous thing rather than doing it by accident. I think in general, that's the point of this kind of thing, right? There was I keep going back to this incident where like AWS basically went down for a while. I mean, S3 crashed, and then a whole bunch of other services crashed because of that, because somebody typed in a command that did a thing that the command should never have allowed them to do, right? Basically, rebooting a whole bunch of, a gigantic percentage of their infrastructure in a certain availability zone. So, when we create tools that let people do things that they shouldn't and then trust people not to do them, someone's eventually going to click that big red button because, why shouldn't they? And I think that's the mentality that we have to go into is if it requires thinking not to do, then someone's eventually going to do it. And if it requires thinking to do, people are much less likely to do it, right? It doesn't mean you make things impossible, but you make things more difficult when there are things that you really want to make sure people are going to be, intentionally doing. The other thing that I think is really important to mention in this context is that sometimes, you really do want to give people text explanation. It is so much better to avoid whenever you can, but sometimes it is really necessary. But people are not going to read a wall of text that's 30 lines long. People are pretty willing to read about 3 lines of text, and I think that's about where it caps out. Honestly, which is like a little bit sad on one hand, the way that the internet has trained us to read very little, but that's the reality, and we have to work with it. So if you absolutely need to provide information, provide that information in 3 lines and give a link to where you can get more information, or a phone number for customer service, or an email or something like that, a chat box. Give a way of getting more information if you need it, but really limit, the essential information. And also keep in mind that, a lot of the time you have this information on a form, but someone might see that form, 300 times over the course of accomplishing a whole bunch of tasks. You only really need them to see it once, but you always want to make sure that it's there for them. So put that information there, but keep it really, really brief so that, once they've already seen this form before, their eyes can kind of just like skip it.
Yeah, and that last point especially reminds me of 2 things, which is like, first, the benefit of like actually doing usability testing, especially once the thing's in front of people. Like I know the book talks about usability testing, like you're in the middle of building it, let's get someone in front of it and see if they can use it. But like, it's also important to like, okay, these people are using, especially if it's a line of business application, like see how they use it and then make adjustments to make their lives easier. Especially when you mentioned, seeing the same form 100 times. One of the projects I currently have at work is for this large financial institution, like a Fortune 100 company, and we have a dozen or so long page form, like, and it's been a constant battle between these 2 edges where legally they have to see and acknowledge lots and lots and lots of information. But the more info we give people, the less likely they are to actually get through the entire form because of all the information. So it's been this game back and forth with the designer and the UX team to rely on like progressive revealment to basically hide as much information as possible until it's needed, because a lot of this information is just like a yes no response type thing. So if you're answering no to 50 of these, technically we know if you answered no to the first one, the next 40 don't really count, because you can't say no to those if the other one was yes, right? Or vice versa. So we're going through another, like a 3rd phase of condensing pages. I think we're down from 10 pages to 4, and now we're going to take down to 3 pages. But now it's a little bit of a misnomer, because that 3rd page could become just super long if you answer all the questions in the right way to keep revealing the sub questions. But at least we've built an experience that allows you to get through in the least amount of time, but while just revealing just the amount of reading you need. You know, revealing a little bit and a little bit. Stuff like that is really nice. And that reminds me of something that we've been relying on a lot in that application, but something this book talks about a lot, which is the idea of relying on conventions, right? Conventions, to be the most basic about it, are things we have decided as a society, as a group, in some culture, that this is how we do things in a certain way, like it or hate it. There are some conventions I'm not a fan of, like the hamburger menu, which has been considered by many people to be a not good convention from a usability perspective. But at this point, it's so ubiquitous, not using it could lead to its own set of problems, right? And Ariel, what are your thoughts on using conventions on the UX side of things? I know we have strong opinions on using conventions in the code side of things.
Yeah, well, I guess I did mention that earlier on, that if there is a convention and you flaunt it, you better have a good reason, because otherwise you're just going to confuse people and make it harder for them to work with the thing that you've created. Look, I think of it like this: in certain countries in the world, you drive on the left side of the road. In most countries in the world, you drive on the right side. That is a lack of agreement that has for sure killed many, many people. There are conventions that are like really, really, really serious, that like you really your life depends on it at all times. There are conventions where it's like, yeah, most places do it this way, but there are other options as well. So that there's I think kind of a whole spectrum in terms of how widespread and how reliable conventions are. I'm not really sure that I have like a whole lot of thoughts about conventions in general. I mean, yes, they're good. Yes, we should use them. Especially if you're making tools that are helping other people build sites, you absolutely need to follow conventions, because otherwise no one's gonna adopt your tool. But in general, right, conventions really boil down to this, don't make me think. We learn conventions at a certain point, and then we stop having to think about them. They become these automatic pathways in our minds, and it's basically an effortless way of helping people not to have to think about things, but to just be able to proceed on instinct. You have to have a really good reason not to do that. If you're like a site whose job it is to flaunt conventions and be unconventional and different, maybe, but even then, I'm not so sure. Yeah, I mean, look, again, in the context of UX, conventions are good. In the context of code, I really do think that there's actually a lot more that's interesting there to say about conventions, just because the conventions aren't as strong. It's very, very clear on a website, right? There's a nav bar on top and maybe on the left side, right? You put on the right side, that's weird. Like that's just confusing your users for no good reason. And definitely do not put on the bottom, because that's just annoying. Like then you have to scroll all the way down in order to find the navigation. Like there are some things you can put on the bottom that are traditionally there, right? Possibly the about us, definitely like the legal information in the terms of service and the careers page and all that kind of stuff, the press releases and brand materials. There's a lot of stuff that goes on the bottom, and that's also conventional, and you shouldn't break that. And you got to think about how to do infinite scroll with that. But these conventions exist, also for a reason. I think a very exciting place right now in terms of conventions outside of the UX world is in terms of APIs. There's a lot of competing standards now. You have the JSON API spec, which is like the worst ever named spec because it's so not Googleable. You have gRPC, you have GraphQL. And you have some other standards that are kind of coming up, but so GraphQL is a little bit different because it's really a whole standard. But a lot of these other things are just kind of ways to organize RESTful JSON APIs, and we're still figuring out what is and isn't a good idea there. Conventions are really cool because computers can read them, but they also help, maybe help people find where things are. Because there's just kind of a standard way of organizing things. I was literally today looking at the GitHub API, and the GitHub API is a great API. I love it. But if you look at the response for a repository, the vast majority of keys in the API end with _URL. And it's just like very, very overwhelming. Like you have to basically Control or Command F in there to find the thing that you're looking for, because there's so much stuff going on, and there's not really a clear organization there. So I'm not sure what standard would help with that per se, but conventions might make it easier to navigate some of these things.
Yeah, I think you nailed exactly what I really enjoyed about the conventions thing, which is conventions are an extension of the "don't make me think" mantra. Anytime you talk about a convention with someone else, you're talking about something that has been so agreed upon and so normalized. Once you learn it, then you don't have to think about it anymore. And I always think of conventions as patterns, and people in general are so good at pattern matching. It's a Unix system line from Jurassic Park. Once you've seen a thing, it's easy for you to see it somewhere else. I've done this style of usability testing, or been on a team that did this style of usability testing on products before, where we investigate, kind of like competitive research. Okay, let's see what are competitors doing in the market, not necessarily to try to take features or anything else, but just to kind of see, okay, is there a standard convention for how this product behaves or how this flows? Because if we are taking, if we're sharing a user base between these for like a line of business application, mimicking those conventions will make it easier for people to go between one or the other. They're not having to relearn the wheel, so to speak, right? So that pattern is replicable. And I think that, again, that same thing definitely applies in code. When you take someone who has learned Rails and I tell them about Phoenix and Elixir, I'm like, it's not Rails, it's different, it has very different conventions, but it does follow some of the same conventions, and we can kind of point out which ones, and they can start replicating those patterns quicker. And when you're dealing with adoption, conventions are, especially on the UX side of things, conventions are very important. You want to follow those. You have to have a very good reason why you're not following a convention, especially if you're talking about a mass market website that's supposed to have really big appeal. So I think that's a good thing to touch on. Jumping around a little bit from there, let's talk a little bit about navigation in general. I know, Ariel, you had taken some notes here about when a nav isn't a nav, and what are your thoughts here on this?
Yeah, so navigation is really interesting. The book absolutely made me think about navigation very differently, because like most people, I think of navigation as what it is, right? Navigation is a way to find stuff on a site, and much in the way that like once upon a time, right? You would go to like yahoo.com and you would see like manual like categorization of stuff on the on the internet. So it was like the top categories, and you kind of click through and you get subcategories and subcategories, and eventually like you reach actual sites. Like that's what navigation is, right? It's it's this like categorization of all the pages on the site, and you basically never use it, and you just run to search. So that's true in terms of what it is, but what Steve Krug points out is there's actually a lot more in terms of what navigation does for you. So it's really to the point where now when I think about navigation, I think of it as it's a thing that it happens to be. You can use it to browse if you really want to find something that way, but that's probably the least important element of the navigation, unless it's like a static site with no search. So the first thing that he says it does is what's here, right? Like I land on a site, I want to know a little bit more about the site. What what does it offer me, right? It's basically a signifier for the affordances of the site. What can this site do for me? If I'm on an e-commerce site, maybe the navigation will tell me what are the departments, what kind of things might I expect to search and find some results. If it's a university website, right? So I might look at the navigation to see, okay, so what are some departments of the university, and what services am I able to to have done for me online, or what phone numbers of different service departments am I going to be able to find on the site. It's a way of just getting a sense of your surroundings, right? The same way that you walk into a grocery store, you might just kind of give a quick glance around of where the different departments are, not just because you want to know where to go to pick up the items on your shopping list, but because you want to make sure this is the kind of store that's going to have the entirety of the stuff that's on my list. Is it that kind of a store, or is it maybe a smaller place that I might expect to have a lot less, or to charge me a higher price. So that's the first thing, right? Again, is just like the what's here. The next thing is, how do I use the site? So I might have a sense of what's here, but when I have a sense, when I really know about what are the different pages that have been built, it might give me different ideas of ways to take advantage of the information that's there. So just for example, again, back to our university example. So maybe I go there to find a to find a phone number. But then when I realize that, oh, there are certain services that I can use that are actually just built online on the site, I can submit certain forms, or I can make certain requests. I want to change a class, whatever it is. I can do that through the site itself. I might change the purpose of my visit. The next thing, which I guess is less relevant to university, is, are the site builders trustworthy, right? These people know what they're doing. Is this a site where I feel safe entering my credit card information? Should I do this through PayPal? Basically, it's a way to build trust. It's a way to build confidence in the site as a product. And that was really very mind-blowing for me. That was a list of 3 things that he gives on in my edition, page 47. But there was another element which I think you have to also throw in from later on in the book, which is, when we go to a site, at least half the time we're following a link, right? And it's not just like a link from, it might be a link from Google, it might be something that someone sent us in an email, or someone posted on whatever social media site. Pick your favorite one, or your least unfavorite one, given privacy violations recently. And then you land somewhere on the site. Okay, so I don't know anything about the site. I don't know where I am within the site. So breadcrumbs are one thing that can help out a lot. Also, if you have links, where the links or not links, sorry, the nav is basically highlighted in a way that reflects where you have where you are. If you had theoretically been browsing within the site, that can be very, very helpful in understanding how drilled down am I, and what are kind of the layers that I could zoom out, what are kind of parallel tracks that I could be going on right now. It's getting your bearings within the site. The nav can be really useful for that. So nav is interesting in that we don't tend to, the book kind of divided everybody into browsers and searchers. I forget what the terms were for the two, but basically some people who kind of want to click on a few things and get to where they're going, and some people who want to just like jump to a search box and get somewhere. I can't really think of the last time I saw somebody really not use a search box if one was available. So unless the search is really, really bad, I think that usually reflects more on the search capabilities of the site than it does on the user. But anyway, yeah, I forgot why I brought that up, but
well, I think it's relevant because I think a lot of what we're talking about nav is how people consume the information on the site. So you've got these 2 types of browser types of people, not web browsers. It kind of reveals a little bit about what your navigation's role is in getting through the site, and like if you have a search, and how good is that search. I know for me personally, while I always prefer Omni searches as like a concept of a feature, I never trust them. So even if there is a search bar, I'm always going to just see if I can navigate there anyways. What I really enjoyed about a lot of the conversations in this book around navigation was the idea of like, we don't have a physical space or a physical metaphor around this. We don't have physicality behind it. You know, if you're in a grocery store, you know you're in the produce section and you know how close in proximity the produce is to dairy and how close dairy is to frozen. It just made me think about how often we lose that trail on a website because it's virtual. You can be near anything at any point, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's always the best option. Like, yes, you should be one click away from everything that's relevant. You shouldn't have to go through the dairy section to get the frozen section on a website, you know, make your entire website on a linked list or something. But it also doesn't mean there's not a benefit in kind of outlining a structure behind things. Like you're saying, like the navigation tells you so much about the site you're in, without giving you the exhaustive, like the sitemap version of the website, which I can, in the last year, have gone to sitemaps as like, I need to know how to get through this webpage and nothing will tell me how to get through it. So I'm going to open the sitemap and I'm going to scroll through until I find exactly what I'm looking for. I think that actually was like on a government site recently where there was just no way to get through the nav. It was impenetrable to actually get to what you wanted. Yeah, and I find all of that really fascinating. And I also thought, you know, this loops back into the blindness effect about how when people use something too often, they're blind to some of the shortcomings. And I know as developers, it's really easy to think of the nav as kind of the last thing you work on, or you just add it when needed. Like, oh, I keep typing in the URL for this. I better add a button for it. Like, okay, if we know the website so well, we can navigate around just by thinking and then typing in the URL bar. It's probably not that approachable for someone who's never seen it before. Or worse, we are hacking around limitations in the usability by using our escape valve of just going to the URL bar and typing it in whenever we want to get somewhere that's too difficult or cumbersome to get to throughout the page. And I guess normal website users do that through bookmarks. It tends to be how they do that. But I don't know as a percentage how often people bookmark parts inside of a website or inside of an application. It'd be a good thing to usability test.
There's really a lot of stuff, and we could go on speaking for a while about this, but there's a lot of interesting things to say about nav and the sense of space, as you said, in the site. You know, again, especially I think this is where I was going with the you know, browsers, searchers distinction, right? You know, especially if you hit a page through search, nav gives you a sense of, okay, but where have I ended up? And, you know, and how might I get here again? There's like a significant part of our brain that's dedicated to maps, right? To physical layouts of things, right? That's the whole idea of the mind palace memory trick, right? Which is basically you imagine a place that you know very well. Let's say you have to remember a list of things. So you imagine each thing in a room in that place, and we're able to remember things just that way because we are programmed at a very deep level to think about things in a spatial way and to reason in terms of maps. There's actually some very cool studies about how that part of the brain expands in cab drivers because so much of their job. I mean, maybe this isn't as true in the age of Google Maps and Waze, but you know, a lot of their job is not just, you know, moving a car around with people in it. It's knowing the turf. It's understanding the territory and how to get around quickly. And knowing all the little places all over town, you know, so when someone says, you know, get me to the blank hotel, they know exactly where to go.
Yeah,
and it's the same thing in terms of using a site. That we want that spatial sense. We want to have a sense of where we are, right? It's the same reason that very often people remember physical books better than ebooks, right? Stuff on Kindle, because you have that sense of space, how far you are through the book. It's very cool stuff. It's very weird, but very, very cool.
Yeah, I mean, we could totally go on a tangent just about that. Like, I definitely observed it myself. I've read about it. It's a very interesting phenomenon. But like, you know, we've had written books for thousands of years. We've had technology for a few decades, and you know, maybe it doesn't take the human brain thousands of years to catch up, but it's going to take it more than one generation. And I know that I find writing notes on physical paper with a pen much better for my recall and for my like sense of mind than I do writing notes on a computer. Like I write notes on a computer all the time because I need them for reference, but I don't have the same recall that I do when I write things down with a pen and paper. But moving on from that, a big part that's important for us, but also a big part of this book is this idea of accessibility, something that we've talked about in the past. Ariel, is there anything you'd like to start us off with talking about how this book approaches accessibility and what does it have to tell us about UX and accessibility?
So I don't want to dive too deep into the chapter, just because we are pretty much at our end time. I will say that I was very happy there's a chapter dedicated to it. I think there's what to discuss in terms of his approach to what's the reason to build accessible stuff, where he basically said, people will give all kinds of reasons, but bottom line, the reason to do it is because it's the right thing to do, and I agree with him. At the same time, as that's not an argument that's going to convince your boss to give you the flexibility to build stuff that's more accessible. So we need all those other reasons too. I just want that to be very clear, right? And as he pointed out in the last chapter, right, you want to convince your boss of stuff, you have to empathize with their position, which I thought was like, oh look, that's what we're all about, right? Dev Empathy Book Club. If you want to convince people of your side, you gotta empathize with their position. So like, I agree it's the right thing to do. And at the same time, you also have to make sure to stock up, with all those other arguments to be ready, when people don't really see it that way, unfortunately. One thing I thought was super cool that he spoke about was a study of how people with disabilities, specifically blind people, use technology differently than your, let's say your standardly abled user. And the thing that was interesting was how sighted people, right, when you scan a page, you look for like big bold words, but it turns out that that's not something that people who are vision impaired can do, because they're not using their eyes to scan the page. And what they actually do instead is they basically listen to the beginning of a paragraph, a few words, maybe a sentence or so, and then they decide, is it worth hearing till the end of the paragraph, or should I just skip to the next paragraph? Which basically means that now it's not just the presentation of your content that matters, but also the order of your content and how much is in the same paragraph. And that means your whole writing style has to be a little bit different in order to be to be more usable to people with vision impairments. So it was very interesting. And it really makes a point of, you have to see how people actually use your product, in order to design it for them. And you have to see how people with disabilities use your product in order to make sure that it's actually usable for them as well. So I thought that was a really interesting tidbit and interesting study. Made me think a lot. I've played around with using screen readers, but it's not really the same as seeing somebody who uses a screen reader all the time experience it. I actually had a sort of funny experience last day or so. So somebody did one of these tweets where they have like the clap emoji between every word because they want to emphasize a point. It's like a meme, whatever. And it sounds so bad on a screen reader. So I responded with a tweet back saying, like, this is really hard for people with screen readers to get through. But between every word, I put in all caps the words clap emoji. And then I went back and I'm like, well, I'm not sure that's actually what comes out of the screen reader. So why don't I check? And it turned out that what the screen reader actually said was clapping hands with light skin tone. And all those words were there between every individual word of the tweet. And I was like, yeah, that's a tweet that's not going to get read by people who are using screen readers, because that's a pain to listen to. So, it's one thing to understand it. It's another to experience it. And it's a third thing to see how people who experience this, not just not just one time, but on a daily basis, compensate for those, right? By having those disabilities and having a different set of tools, they're going to develop a different set of abilities that you have to think about.
Yeah. And as we talked about in the past, like accessibility is so important and it's the right thing to do. And like everything you're saying is just reiterating the point of like, you need to do the testing. You can't just like, I mean, the bare minimum you can do is just put some ARIA labels on there, make sure you have your alt tags and your titles put, like those are the bare minimum, but like that's not sufficient in the like grand scheme of things. You need to let people use your app. You know, you need to pay those testers to come in, use it, get their actual feedback from their lived experience. Like this is good, this is bad, so that you can design it the right way. Because you know, being a person who hasn't had any any experience using screen readers, you know, even just my assumption of what I would prefer as an interface is probably like some kind of weird programmer interface of getting through, and that could make it even more confusing. Like I don't know, to go back to an earlier point, what the conventions are or best practices around navigating complex content with a screen reader. I would need to rely on those people who have lived that to really make sure I'm building that correctly in a way that is good for all of them. And yeah, I like your very last point there, or what you said in the middle, that book is about empathy. Like it's about empathy for your users, which is what we're here about. And I like that. Something I've always liked about UX is that it is a little bit of human psychology, but it's a lot of being empathetic for how people use your site, like trying to make it easier for them, because honestly, we're building websites for people to use. So we should care how they use it. We should care what they do with it. And I think it's important to read this and help ourselves learn a little bit more. Do you have any closing thoughts before I send us off?
I actually do have one more thing about accessibility, which is a point that the book makes, but I think is really important to reiterate, which is that the whole idea of "don't make me think" is, you know, the more effort something is, right? Whether it's mental effort, whether it's, you know, an extra few clicks and, you know, an extra thing to fill out, whatever it is, every bit of effort is going to create drop off, and every bit of effort is going to create whatever is the I guess bad will or a loss of goodwill, right? He talks about the goodwill reservoir and how, you know, different things can drain it, which I thought was a kind of a neat metaphor and something that's useful to think about. I think we have to make sure that we're also thinking about the goodwill reservoir and cognitive load on programmers. And what I mean by that is, especially in the context of accessibility, like the real reason why so many sites are inaccessible is because it's hard. It's hard to make a site accessible, and this is something that the author complains about, right? The tools that are out there, and I have a friend, Liz Serta, she's now an accessibility consultant professionally, and you know, and for a long time before that, at my previous company, she was carrying the accessibility torch, and her biggest complaint is always that the standard tools that are out there, they're not built with accessibility in mind. Yeah. And you know, the reality is it's really, really hard to do, and there's a lot of work that's involved. And you know, the same way, don't make me think, like, don't make me program, don't make me write extra stuff. Like, let's figure out how to make the tools in a way that are accessible by default. That needs to be something that is just like inexcusable in designing, especially a front end tool. It needs to always be accessible, just by default. Like, you have to work really, really hard to make it not accessible. Like that's the level that that we'd like to go for, and I hope things change. There's definitely a lot more chatter on the airwaves, so to speak, about A11Y these days, and that is encouraging. You know, but we really have to make it that, you know, you don't have to think in order to make a site accessible. There's always going to be, you know, elements of it that you do have to think about, but you know, stuff about it, you know, where you put information and how you organize it, right? We mentioned the example of just the order that you put text in a paragraph can matter. There are going to be things that you have to think about, but the more we can minimize that, the more accessible the web is going to be. One thing I think is really cool, by the way, which my company has been involved with, Cloudinary. So we created a color blindness filter. So essentially, our whole, you know, business is basically, you know, to sum it up in very, very briefly, right? But we we take images, we transform them, and then we serve them through a CDN. So one of the filters we recently came out with is a color blindness filter. So it actually applies. It's very experimental. It's very cool, but it applies visual distortion to an image in order to make it to make it that people who are colorblind can still distinguish between differently colored regions. And so the idea is that you shouldn't have to think about how to make my site specifically accessible to colorblind people. You should be able to just kind of run it through a filter, basically on request, right? They click a button and now all the images are run through this filter, and they can properly see the way that your site's looking. Like, the more tools we have for that, the more we're able to just kind of not think about it, right? Don't make me think, just make the site accessible. Which comes down to the tools that we're using to build the site, as well as tools that we might build on top of the site. The more accessible the web is going to be.
Yeah, and the more accessible the web is, the better it is for everyone. I think that's a good thing. So we'll leave it at there. There's tons more to talk about, but we will be picking up next month on another book, which is Rocket Surgery Made Easy, I believe. There it is. Yeah, Rocket Surgery Made Easy. So we'll be picking up that one to kind of discuss a kind of a second go at this, so to speak. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a good second conversation. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us today. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just said I'm excited.
Good. I'm glad we're both excited.
It's going to be just diving into the nitty gritty of, okay, so what does a usability test look like? A lot of the finer points of there was one long chapter in this book about that. We specifically did not talk about that today because we're going to get into that very, very deeply in the next book. So it should be fun.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. You can stay updated about Dev Empathy events by following us on Twitter @DevEmpathy. And of course, don't forget to join us on Slack using the link on our site, which is devempathybook.club. We're looking forward to interacting with you and growing as a community as we become better developers and better people. All right, bye now.